China Foreign Minister Wang Yi set to meet Afghan Taliban leaders in Doha this week. The meetings have begun already, the talks marking the first high-level engagement between China and the Taliban since the militant group took over in Kabul following the withdrawal of the U.S.'s troops. The senior Chinese diplomat expected to raise the situation in Afghanistan and issues of mutual concern during the meeting. Joining me right now is Fox News senior strategic analyst General Jack Keane. General, it is always a pleasure. Great to see you this morning. Common interest between the CCP and the Taliban. Let's talk about that. What do you think?
Well, we said from the outset, if we're going to give up the 7 military bases and the multiple CIA bases in Afghanistan, that the direct beneficiaries of the U.S. withdrawal would be China, Russia, Iran, and Pakistan. In other words, the countries that border Afghanistan, except for Russia, which is one country away. And we can see here and now what is really taking place. The Chinese are likely going to buy their way into Afghanistan. What is happening internally in Afghanistan is also a major factor here. The banking system has failed. There's significant food shortages. Inflation is spiraling out of control. It is heading towards a human catastrophe in terms of the suffering the people are going to ensue here. And also it's likely heading to a failed state and a civil war. The Taliban leadership needs money, and that is what they're talking to the Chinese about. Not a single country has recognized the Taliban as a government. And that's likely because everybody recognizes them as a terrorist organization that happens to be in control of a country. And they are going to be completely dependent, at least initially, on donor gifts. So what is China's interest here? They have two interests, Maria. One is security. They do not want the terrorists who could form inside of Afghanistan spilling over into their western province, Xinjiang, where the Uyghurs are and where the Chinese believe they already have a radical Islamic movement. So that's number one concern that they have, and they'll make certain that the Taliban understand they're not going to put up with that. And the second thing, certainly, is they have significant interest in Afghanistan's minerals. They already have licensing rights to the copper, but they haven't been able to exploit it because of the conflict. Now they'll be able to exploit it. But they're interested in the lithium and the uranium and also in the gold. The fact is Afghanistan is rich in mineral deposits, and China wants to exploit that and extend their Belt and Road Initiative, which their signature platform is Pakistan, to the west into Afghanistan. So, yes, that's what this is about. But they're going to condition the Taliban to make certain that the terrorists stay out of China.
Yeah, well, look, they could get a leg up on all of this. Let's talk for a second about that $1 trillion in rare earth minerals. Those minerals are used to make electronics. I mean, it's also an issue of Taiwan, because that's one of the reasons, I assume, that the CCP wants to reunify Taiwan. They want to dominate the market in semiconductor chips with Taiwan Semiconductor. So I want to get your take on that. But first, given that new relationship, this partnership between the Taliban and the CCP, leave it to the communists to acknowledge this group, which just pulled off a coup. Are they also going to take over Bagram Air Base? And then I want to ask you about Taiwan, because Jen Psaki refused to say whether or not the U.S. would defend Taiwan if China were to invade. What about Bagram?
Well, I don't think that's really in China's strategic interest to actually occupy an air base inside of Afghanistan, a country being run by a terrorist organization, knowing full well that if they occupied that air base, there's going to be pushback on them from other terrorists inside of Afghanistan, particularly ISIS. I don't think they want any part of that. I know there's been some pundits who are expressing that as an objective, but I don't see that in China's strategic interest, occupying a base inside of Afghanistan. What they want are the minerals, and that's what they're going to pursue.
Yeah. What about Taiwan? So the Journal this morning reporting that government officials in Taiwan and the U.S. are saying that the island's military is filled with internal problems, General, like poor preparation, low morale, that if China were to invade, Taiwan would not be able to hold the line. And then there's the issue about the U.S. White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki last week, said that she refused to say whether the U.S. would defend Taiwan militarily if China invaded Friday. She just kept, reiterating that the policy has not changed, despite the fact that Joe Biden said that the U.S. would be there, which is not the policy, right?
Well, first of all, dealing with China and Taiwan, I mean, clearly Taiwan is no match militarily for China. They would not be able to defend themselves. I mean, you just compare the population, 1.4 billion, to a little around 24 million. GDP in China is 15 trillion, and in Taiwan it's 710 billion, and the military is over 2 million standing active forces in China. 187,000. So there is no match here. There's a significant imbalance. Taiwan has always been dependent, that they believe that their freedom rides certainly on the allies and principally the United States that will come to defend them. What China's military is about is, and I've been there and seen it, is their intent is to impose cost on China, to delay their victory by taking Taiwan, to slow the advance of their amphibious assault and their air attack as much as possible, so that the allies, and particularly the United States, will be able to come to their defense. That is the military plan that exists inside of Taiwan. Now, what you're referring to is the 1979 Taiwan Relations Act, where the United States said that it will continue. When it recognized China, Jimmy Carter did this, and pulled away from diplomatic relations with Taiwan, so we have unofficial relationship with them. What we decreed is we would assist them building their military capacity. In other words, foreign military sales, materials and supplies, etc. But we left off the table any mention of actually coming to their defense. It's so-called strategic ambiguity. And that's what President Biden, he's done it a couple of times, back in August and now. He said, well, we would defend Taiwan because we have a commitment. I don't really know what's going on in his head. I hope that's what he really intends to do, to be frank about it, Maria. But I don't know whether that's really his intent, or is he just mistaken about what our policy actually says. Certainly the White House rolled that back a little bit. But there's no doubt in our minds that President Biden has done some good things to shore up Taiwan. He's continued the flow of military assistance there that President Trump did, and he certainly has helped to revitalize the allies. Japan has come out and said they would defend Taiwan. The EU is moving to a closer relationship with Taiwan. There's been significant momentum towards Taiwan, largely driven by President Xi's aggressive behavior, crushing the democracy in Hong Kong and what he's done with the Uyghurs, and just his overall malign activity. And certainly the spread of COVID is a major factor here. So Taiwan is a country that people are looking at, and that's a thriving democracy. And certainly I would hope that this country is committed to defending it.
Yeah, and don't forget about the semiconductors, Taiwan Semiconductor. They would really dominate, even more so, supply chains, make it hard for us to get cars if they owned Taiwan Semi as well. General, it's always good to see you. Thank you, sir.